Hello, and welcome to today's presentation around the Medical Technology Symposium. Before we introduce your speakers today, I'd like to go into some webinar logistics. So we do have this webinar slated for 2 hours with a Q&A. And just as a note, all attendees have been muted. And thus, if there is a question you would like to ask to our presenters during the webinar, please use the chat or Q&A function on the sidebar of the GoToWebinar app, and then we'll address as many questions as possible throughout the webinar. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our 5 presenters for today. First is Angela Sivanek. She's a director of regulatory strategy and policy and has over 30 years of clinical and device experience. She has written and provided guidance and advice for over 100 clinical evaluation reports for a wide variety of devices. During her career as a nurse, she gained deep practical experience with many of the types of devices she has developed and implemented clinical evaluation strategies. She has even written a book on peripherally inserted central catheters, which provides details on how to insert and care for PICCs and ensure compliance with the recommendations for use. Our second presenter for today is Lee Stern. She is our Vice President and Global Head of Consulting Operations and is responsible for all health economic and market access engagements for global clients. She also oversees the full operations of our New York office, and she is a strategic, actionable leader managing highly qualified and scientifically robust, cross-functional and geographically disparate teams. And then our final 3 speakers for today, Sean Bates. He is our Vice President, Global Portfolio Leader for our base case stakeholder engagement platform. After gaining over 20 years of experience working across the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. Having held a variety of senior leadership positions, his expertise lies in stakeholder engagement and management in the market access and medical affairs spaces. Our 4th speaker is Hua Yan. Hua is the director as part of Certara's Evidence and Access Group. Hua joins from Novo Nordisk, where he spent 4 years supporting the development of the company's long-term enterprise strategy. As a strategist, Hua continually tackles one of healthcare's biggest challenges. How do you build sustainable business models in the face of accelerating change in U.S. healthcare? He combines the perspective with Certara's unique data capabilities and tech platforms to empower clients not only to lower the cost of innovation, but to maximize realized value from those investments. And finally, we have Walt Denker, formerly trained as a neuropharmacologist. Walt has over 20 years of experience with Johnson & Johnson in the pharmaceutical and medical device sectors. His diverse business experience spans sales and marketing leadership, innovation and health economics, and market access. Currently the HEMA lead for wound closure and biosurgery. His expertise lies in evidence generation and dissemination strategies to support market access and adoption globally. So to kick off today's agenda, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Hua to run through the next few slides. Hua?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Danny. I don't know if it's just me, but I certainly always get a smile on my face when I hear someone else reading my bio. It's certainly a bit of a surreal process. So thanks so much for that really comprehensive introduction there. Welcome everyone to our symposium today. We've got 3 really amazing talks on sort of the future of medical devices and what does that really mean for your organization and your strategy and the path ahead. So in terms of the agenda, we're first going to talk about some new trends and regulatory settings with Angela, amazing thought leader, as we just talked about, great practical and on-hand experience as to what this actually means, both from a strategic and from an implementation level. We'll then move into talking about evidence generation needs and a broader context on, well, what's really going on here? What does that really mean for the types of data and outcomes that you need to show? And then we'll have a bit of a break and then finally close off with Sean's amazing section surrounding, well, now that you have this information, what do you do with it? What's the best way to communicate and really drive that alignment across some of the rest of the industry to make sure that your organization is really set up for success? Across each of these sections, we'll have a bit of a presentation, and then we'll go into some Q&A so that we can hear your thoughts and your takes on some of the topics that we talked about and answer any of your questions from our experts. Before we get there, though, we do have a few slides just introducing us more holistically as an organization, what we're all about, and why we're even doing this today. So our mission as Certara is actually quite simple. We're here to shorten the time from an innovation going from lab to changing people's lives. That's really about it. Our job is to try and accelerate the cycle of innovation that has resulted in so many wonderful life-changing technologies and therapeutic options, and really make sure that we're harnessing and helping our clients harness the power of that cycle of innovation, speeding it up with more tech efficiency, making sure that you're able to create more sustainable business models on the back end. That's core and center to what we do here at Certara. Next slide, please. And the way we really get there is we help our clients think through things from a very holistic level, starting all the way from the R&D side of integrated drug development, integrated sort of R&D processes, all the way into the sort of commercialization aspect of having evidence, value, and access services and capabilities under our belts here. This slide has a lot of words, but the bolded part is here is what you really need to understand. Our results speak for ourselves, and since 2014, customers who use our technology, our services, have received over 90% of all drug and biologic approvals. We play a very core infrastructure role within the ecosystem today to make sure that innovation, again, goes from lab to changing lives. Next slide, please. One of the biggest reasons for our success is our global and holistic focus, right? We have offices spread across the world, and in tandem with that, access to a wide variety of global experts across how healthcare is really implemented, what healthcare really means to different markets. Not only do we have a strong U.S. presence, which is the largest, I believe, single market for a lot of healthcare innovation, but we also have presence in the EU and, of course, Asia Pac as well. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we also really recognize in working in the life sciences is that it's not always just about the tech. It's also about the people, the expertise that they bring into making all of this happen. We have over 900 specialized employees, and our gamut of capabilities from a human resource perspective ranges all the way from PhDs and different sort of and traditional sort of PharmD, MD consultants, all the way into software developers and UX UI experts. So you should feel safe that we have everyone needed to make sure that your idea goes all the way to fruition. Next slide, please. And finally, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that our services are delivered through a proprietary and scalable platform. The important thing here is that we're full service. We go all the way from discovery all the way to post-approval. Our services run the entire gamut of discovery and innovation, all the way into market access and how you actually capture that value. So we take a broad view on the industry, and we're able to help with just about any problem that you might have. That's the strength of Certara, that we are active participants and thought partners, no matter your place in the life cycle of innovation today. So with that, and that's sort of our background, I'd like to turn over to Angela to actually start on why you're here, which is the content of today's symposia. So Angela, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. I'm going to discuss a few of the major regulatory trends in the medical device world. Thanks, Wah, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone that's attending today or watching this later. So let's get started. There we go. Okay, a little delay in my movement. So there are so many changes happening in the medical device regulatory world that today I just wanted to focus on 3 geographies and go into those a little bit deeper. And I'd be remiss if I didn't start with Europe. So we're going to talk about MDR, which is the medical device regulation, and the in vitro diagnostic regulation, and the guidance documents related to that have been coming out and continue to come out. And then I'm going to move on to the UK. What does that mean post-Brexit? And then last but not least, a couple new guidance, draft guidances that have come out in the United States. So Europe, starting with Europe, since the majority of changes have and are happening there. I'm going to back up a little bit for anybody that isn't familiar with regulatory and the world in Europe. And if you are, please, bear with me. I just want to make sure we have all the same vocabulary here. But the EU is made up of a commission. That's their governing body. That commission is made up of 28 member states, and those member states each have designated notified bodies, which perform conformity assessment or review of the medical device submissions. A little different than here. There's dozens of notified bodies to go through and figure out which one is applicable for your device and meets your needs. And then from there, the manufacturer and/or economic operator has met the conformity assessment, and they can CE mark their devices. Oops, back up. There we go. Okay, so what's happened and how did we get to where we are now? Just a little review in case you're not familiar or you're only familiar with part of it. In 2016, my specialty at that time was writing and managing clinical evaluation reports. And so the MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4 was released. And that kind of turned my world upside down, but it really foreshadowed what was going to happen in 2017 when the EU MDR and the IVDR were both published. So at that time, the MDR had a 3-year transition period. COVID came to be, and they gave us a year extension. But those certificates, if you're only under MDD or the Medical Device Directive, those will be expiring in May of 2024. So you will need to get MDR certified. Now, what's new and exciting is IVDR. Europe is never keeping us guessing here. They are always keeping us guessing. As we thought that IVDR was going into full effect in May of 2022, but now they have in October published an amendment and have a transition plan, which I will discuss moving forward. And then within the midst of all of this, Brexit happened, and so the UK is no longer part of the EU. So starting with the medical device regulation, sorry, the slides are a little touchy. That went into effect, as I mentioned, full effect May of 2021, which meant that companies had to recertify under MDD prior to that date. Usually it was actually, depending on your notified body, like 6 months or a year before that, as it was taking them 6 months to a year to approve those documents. And so as part of that, I'm having slide issues. Looks like we might be missing a slide. Yep. So I'm going to go back and forth because these are switched a little bit. But the MDR, some of the key things with MDR specifically is that I found the requirements for all device manufacturers have to have a quality system in place, as well as having a designated responsible person for regulatory compliance. So, and additionally, every device now has to have the unique device identification or UDI. And the essential requirements were replaced by the general safety and performance requirements. And there were changes, which are a lot of what we do every day, to the technical documentations and new documentation requirements specifically for clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up, and the periodic safety report. See if I can back up. Nope. Sorry, my slides got out of order. There we go. I was supposed to check that, but I missed that one. Okay, so as part of the guidance for the medical device MDR and IVDR, the medical device coordination groups were formed, and the MDCG, as I'll call them for short, that's made up of 2 members from each member state. One has medical device experience and one has in vitro diagnostic experience. So this is kind of a modified screenshot of a lot of the things that I'll be talking about, but just just so that you recognize that there is probably about 70 guidance documents related to MDR and IVDR that have been published, and another 30 that are pending. And as you can see from this screenshot, a lot of them are on clinical data and clinical evaluation. I'm going to skip to, sorry. Okay, so documentation. As I mentioned, documentation has been a huge change. And specifically clinical evaluation plans and reports. Those are something near and dear to my heart as I've written and reviewed so many of them. But clinical evaluation was existent before MDD, or before with MDD, but with the MedDev, it really changed, and MDR made it law. So one of the first changes, as I want to point out, is that clinical evaluation isn't just a report anymore. It's a process, and it starts with a plan. And that plan is really expected to be formalized and generally written out. So that's new for a lot of people, a new document. But additionally, before Class 1 devices did not have to have a clinical evaluation, and now they do. Another key change was the qualifications to authors. This was really interesting when, the type of physician that we had approving our CERs was no longer qualified to be a reviewer because he did not have experience with that specific device. So that is something they're looking at. We have to include the CVs for the authors and evaluators to make sure that they're actually, they have a relevant degree allowing them to use or prescribe the device, and that they have experience with the device. Regular updates. I can't tell you enough about this. So when this all started, I did 9 clinical evaluation reports that year. And the next year, we did 23. So those regular updates were that Class 2B and Class 3 devices really needed to be done annually. And the others needed to be done every 2 to 5 years. And that depended on how long they were on the market. So if you were just launching a Class 1 device that you never had to write one for before, now that required an annual update until it was well established. Equivalent devices, there is a whole MDCG guidance document on equivalent devices, and I could give a whole talk on that. But just know that you have to now own the technical documentation if you are claiming equivalence to a device. So that no longer means that if you're like a competitor's device that you can claim equivalence to them, not unless they're going to sign an agreement and say that you can have access to their technical documentation. So this next one, guidelines for literature, this speaks to my group's experience, but also into our next presenter, Lee. They've really gone into that you can't just willy-nilly your lit searches for clinical data, and that you have to have a methodologically sound clinical literature search. And they want to see the whole thing. They want to know why you included everything and excluded everything. You have to include full text articles and appraisal. And it has to be repeatable so that they know that you didn't just pick the data that you like on your device. And then lastly, again, whole guidance document on this, but that you can provide sufficient clinical data. So what sufficient is sometimes a debatable term. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Next, post-market surveillance. Again, now you need a plan and a report. That wasn't, of course, everybody had a PMS system before, but now you need a plan and you need a report. So for each device, the manufacturer has to plan, establish, document, implement, maintain, and update a PMS system. And it's appropriate based on your device class and the type of device. But the data that you gather has to guide your benefit risk determination and help you update the design. manufacturing info, IFUs, and labeling. And more importantly, you have to show that you're doing all of this. Like, how does the circle of life of your documents feed into each other? And then that feeds into the summary of safety and performance report, as well as, preventative and corrective field safety actions, as well as usability, performance, and safety of the device, and detection and reporting of trends. Post-market clinical follow-up. I actually had to look this up, like, what does that mean? So it's interesting because you're doing this whole PMS, we're collecting the data, we're showing the trends, but that's not enough anymore. Now we have to have a proactive process, which means you have to be actively looking for any gaps that you've identified. So the clinical evaluation is going to kind of say you may have a new device. It might be slightly different than your last device. Let's say now it can do power injection. And so now what are you going to do to show that that power injection is really that you're evaluating that difference moving forward? And so you can do that a lot of different ways, but power injection isn't probably going to pass with these lower ones. You'll probably have to do more clinical studies, but for a smaller difference, you might be able to get by with some clinical experience or user feedback or surveys, or lit reviews are sometimes accepted. And then you can also look at registries. There's lots of information in registries that can be accessed and evaluated and presented for them as well. So it doesn't always mean, but sometimes it does mean a clinical study or a clinical trial. Now this last one, the periodic safety update report, all new. It's outlined in Article 86 of the MDR. It should be a snapshot of your PMS data, and it has output from the PMS plan, confirming your benefit risk of the device. It needs to be integrated into your risk management, clinical evaluation, and PMS process. But at the same time, it's not your PMS report, although it still needs to stand on its own. So it's got to have some of that data. And then UTMED, we haven't seen it yet, but when we do, the PSURs for class 3 and implantable devices will need to be reported there. And the PSURs will need to be updated every 2 years for class 2A and yearly for class 2B and class 3 devices. So a lot of paperwork happening a lot of times here, and each of these feeding into each other. And for legacy devices, that data needs to start from May 26th of 2021. So if you haven't started yours already, you need to go back to that date and have a report probably ready or including up to May 26th of this year for your class 3s. The in vitro diagnostic regulation, as mentioned, was also released in April of 2017 and was set to go in full effect in May of 2022. But now we're excited to say everybody was waiting and watching for a transition plan. And we got more than a year, but it's definitely needed. So they released an amendment to the IVDR in October. Some of these, the reasons for the transition are that basically the IVDs did not normally require notified body oversight. So currently there's 8% of all IVDs before the regulation goes into effect that needed a notified body. But with this new regulation, 80% are going to need a notified body review. So that means not only do they need to submit to the notified body, but they have to find one and they have to apply to the notified body. And as of October, there was 6. So it's not like the dozens with medical devices. So you really need to get in there and get that done. So one thing this is showing is that if you weren't needing a notified body before, you need to have your CE certificate or your declaration of conformity drawn up by May 26th of 2022. And for Class A non-sterile under IVDR, that nothing is changing. That's May of 2022. So they kind of took a most risk besides the Class A's to least risk approach. So the Class D devices have till May 26th of 2025. Class C's have till 2026, and Class B's and Class A steriles have till 2027. So those devices, those in vitro diagnostics that have the most risky will have the least amount of time to get that ready. A few things to consider with this is that the reviews are taking 9 to 11 months once the application has been received. So in the interim, you could be revising your IVDR implementation plan, updating your clinical performance study process, and updating your post-market process, including vigilance, and make sure you have your economic operator registered with UDMED. So key changes with this, a little bit, the main thing is the classes of devices. A, B, C, and D didn't exist before. So there's going through the rules and deciding what your class of device is, and a lot of that's going to depend on what the intended purpose is. So you need to be really clear what your intended purpose is. And then similarly to MDR, the technical files have updates. They need to be readily searchable. And then your documentation, different names, similar reports. Performance evaluation report is similar to clinical. You will need a post-market surveillance plan and report. You will need a post-market clinical follow-up plan and report. And depending on the class of device, you will need a periodic safety report as well. Okay, so moving on to the UK. I did write a blog on this. It's a little bit more extensive, so you can look to that as well. But I'm just going to briefly touch on what the UK is doing and done since Brexit happened. They're continuing with MDD, IVDD, and AIMDD for now. They will be coming up with their own, so stay tuned. But some of the key changes that happened was they came out with a UK CA mark. So that is similar to the CE mark. It's what will be put on your labels to say you've passed conformity assessment. You will need a UK approved, You will need a UK approved notified body, as well as registering your devices in the UK, and you will need a UK responsible person. So yes, Northern Ireland is part of the UK, kind of except for this. So because of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998, Northern Ireland will still be with Europe for the most part and follow EU MDR and IVDR as far as those timelines, except for one kind of key thing is that you have to register with the MHRA, which you didn't have to do before. If you are have a product for Northern Ireland, you will need an authorized representative for EU or Northern Ireland, and it would be for Northern Ireland if you're just selling in Northern Ireland, and you will continue to need a CE mark. Did I get the slide to move? There we go. Okay, so last but not least, the US and the Center for Device and Radiological Health. This again has a lot of information, a lot of guidance documents that come out every day. So I'm just going to focus on a couple. The first one is real real world evidence. I knew this was going to be a hard word for me to say. So they came out with a new publication. It's called Framework for FDA's Real World Evidence Program. And real world evidence is based off of real world data. So what is that? Which will lead to some of this as well. Real world data is relating to patient health status or delivery of healthcare routinely collected from different sources. So things that I always thought should be included, but we never looked at really, like the patient electronic health records, claims and billing activities, registries, patient-generated data, and data generated from other sources that can inform on health status, such as mobile devices. So from there, the real-world data and analysis of it can give you real-world evidence. Now, when that's presented to the FDA, you will have to tell them where that evidence came from, but it still can be considered evidence. Again, a whole nother webinar could be on just this one. Okay, so these next two are guidance documents. The first one here, draft guidance for digital health technologies for remote data acquisitions. Digital health technologies, it's defined as any tool that may be used in a clinical investigation to collect information. And that information, it could be clinical, physiological, psychological, behavioral, functional. It's generally derived from sensor-based technologies, software-based applications, or general purpose computing platforms. So some of the key takeaways for me on this included that it's being used in these decentralized clinical trials, which is a clinical investigation that's not taking place at an investigator site. So it could even be a patient's house. And this is, definitely become a thing over the past 2 years. And the next thing that I thought was quite interesting is that you don't necessarily have to have your DHT cleared with FDA to be used in a clinical trial. It just depends on what the purpose is of the device. So, for example, if it's diagnosing or treating, it will need clearance. The next one, the fit for purpose, that was like, this random fit for purpose. What does that mean? They describe it as a conclusion that the level of validation is sufficient to support its proposed use. So that means it should be verified. In other words, what it measures is done accurately and precisely. It needs to be validated, showing it appropriately assesses the data it's collecting, and it has to have usability testing performed. So, like, especially for these devices that are out in the real world, the person that is using the device needs to be able to apply the device, transmit the information, and make sure it's valid in their environment. So last but not least, COVID, we couldn't get by without talking just a little bit about COVID. And so this is 2 draft guidances. The last one was also a draft guidance. And the last one, they're accepting feedback, I think, till March 22nd. This one, these 2, they're accepting feedback through March 23rd. And they're actually, FDA is having a webinar next week, Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So if you want to jump on that, it's going to be a whole WebEx on that. So, and hopefully we'll get a lot more clarity on this. But basically, these last 2 guidances are a transition plan for medical devices. So with COVID-19, we had the need for a lot of emergency use authorizations for testing devices. And then we also had the need for a lot of surgical masks and protective PPE. And so they made these, the first one is for enforcement policies. And a lot of that is related to the masks and the gowns and the protective equipment, and what will be enforced and what won't be enforced. And then the other one is related to anything that has an emergency use authorization. So the main point is that a lot of people were able to sell a lot of devices without a lot of oversight because the need was there. Basically the FDA is saying thank you, but it's not going to exist forever. So they have this draft guidance. It's got a 3-phase transition plan, but what it really boils down to is that once they set the date in the final guidance document that that this is the date that this enforcement policy will end, you're going to have 180 days. And if you want to keep selling your device, you're going to need to have submitted your documentation and have it accepted. So no longer, or you're going to have a phase out plan. And there is going to be a sell-off time period that they're going to allow too. Their main thing that they're looking for is a smooth transition. So they don't want manufacturers to, or the public to, suddenly not have any surgical masks. But at the same time, they want to make sure that we all know that this isn't going to continue forever, and that we're moving back to device, 510Ks and PMAs and the full process again. And I think that to summarize that, so the trends are everything's changing, and it's changing a lot. It continues to be Europe leading the majority of the changes. And as a result of Brexit, the UK is going to, in the next year or two, come out with its own guidance documents. Kind of with COVID, we've seen a pause in a lot of things, like MDR and IVDR had that pause and now a longer transition. The UK Brexit, I don't know if they'll continue with MDD and IVDD and AIMDD, or if they've been able to draft their own guidances, but we'll see about that. As I mentioned, also Northern Ireland will continue to kind of regulatorily be part of Europe, but it will need registration in, sorry about that, will need registration in with the MHRA. So with that, I don't know if we have any questions, Wah.
Yeah, we actually do have a question, and it kind of resonates. First of all, great presentation, a lot of fantastic detail there. I really kind of resonate with that comment on things are changing all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So one key question that kind of came up and kind of marries also a little bit of my interest is timing on all of this, right? With regulations changing, that does have an impact on regulatory approval timelines. So how long are some of these approvals for new devices really going to take, particularly in Europe, where a lot of these shifts are occurring?
Yeah, so I can tell you that my experience is on a class 3 device over the past couple of years. We submitted, it took 6 months to get questions back, and then another month or 2 to answer those questions. Then we resubmit in another 6 months, and then they come back and they had one more question. So, I would say 6 months minimum if you have no questions. And that timeline can really, depending on your class of device, and if they need extra panel reviews and so forth, it could be a year and a half or longer.
A year and a half, so 6 months minimum, year and a half or longer. Yes. Definitely something to keep in mind, I think, for all of our stakeholders as you're thinking about planning and as you're thinking about how you're giving yourself space to navigate those changes. And of course, how long it takes for you to get to market. Right?
Yeah, and I think a key thing to take away from that is really to do it right the first time. So to make sure that the documentation that you submit checks all those boxes so that you don't have a first, second, third round of questions.
Yeah, well, one of our specialties, just throwing that out there. Thanks so much, Angela, for a fantastic presentation. I'd like to turn it over to Lee to talk a little bit about evidence generation. What kind of information are you really looking to provide in order to get some of this traction happening? So, Lee, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Angela, for setting up my presentation very well, actually. I think the theme here is really about rigor of evidence, right? And your last point about getting it right the first time really resonates with me as well, because I really have seen in our experience that it's not just about the regulatory landscape and the regulatory challenges and changes, but there's also commercialization and market access challenges that the device and medtech industry has been facing. And getting that evidence has become even more paramount. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the market access challenges that we've seen here at Certara in helping our clients achieve the mission of bench to market, right? Getting that innovation all the way through. Some of the landscape changes that Angela discussed, are here on one side of the slide. But really what I'm focused on is, how have we seen the landscape change recently, and how has that created even more challenge for our clients in the market access and getting, the actual pull through and uptake of their device or med tech. And again, as Angela said, we can't not talk about COVID, right? So how has COVID changed the landscape? We've seen so many procedures, elective procedures, be canceled recently in hospitals. And what that does is it creates this really dire financial situation for hospitals. And it makes it harder for them to accept innovation and change when they're in such a scared state in their financials. This is especially true in orthopedic surgeries, general surgeries. When all of those procedures stopped because of COVID, the financial pressures became really, really great. There's also changes in coverage, Part B Medicare, et cetera. And these changes are expected to even come through even more in the next couple of years. So we're keeping an eye on that as well. All of this is to say that it's a very, very challenging environment. So as Wah has presented in our sort of overall vision of, hastening the time from bench to market, how does this apply to devices in this landscape? It is really important to be even more vigilant and comprehensive in establishing the value for money. So as an innovator, and as a lot of our clients, and including Walt, really has these wonderful innovations, how do we get them through? How do we get them through this financial environment? What we have seen is that the HEOR and market access leads within our clients' companies are interacting earlier with the clinical and regulatory folks, making sure that those endpoints are resonating with whoever the ultimate payer is going to be, which is much more complicated in the device space because it's not necessarily just one single payer. It can be hospital payers. Clinicians have a lot to say about, the uptake and use of device and put pressure. So we've seen that the success really comes from working very collaboratively internally among these divisions to enable the value argumentation to be very clear at the end of the day. It's also very important to understand the payment pathways for optimal reimbursement and understanding what those hurdles might be and understanding them earlier on. And we'll get to some examples of that when we look at how real-world data and other actual tactics can help with that. Switching the slide here. So when we try and understand how to move forward with our innovative device or technology, what we've been seeing recently is that this is very big gap to fill, right? There's a supply chain issue happening right now. There's very long lead times for reimbursement. Getting a code assigned, for example, thinking about maybe early access and NTAP programs, all of these things and take a really long time. And even as Angela was saying on the regulatory side, taking so long, we see that also on the market access side. Hospitals and clinicians are pushing for some of these innovations, but when the reimbursement codes aren't provided yet, it is really, really difficult to bridge that gap and get those technologies out there quickly to the patients and who we want to serve. So reimbursements also are historically very low, and we will be showing a couple of examples of how difficult it is when a new device has to be included within the reimbursement, such as the DRG. And this happens in countries like Germany as well as the US. So establishing the value early on is exceptionally important to help fill this gap that we see. So Wa, I think you're going to take this slide.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Lee. So what does all of this stuff mean to the audience, right? I think one of the things that is a running theme whenever we talk about these things is we have these high-level trends. MedTech is facing these dual risks, right? You've got regulatory on one side, you've got access and commercialization on the other. What does this actually mean materially for what you as a company need to think about if you're trying to bring a new innovation to the market? And I think where we wanted to start is centering that on how does this change customer expectations or customer behaviors when it comes to medical devices? What are payers looking for? What are hospitals looking for? First thing we're going to cover is what payers are actually looking for. And in this sort of regulatory environment and in this sort of challenging commercial environment, we're seeing that payers are expecting more robust evidence in order to support coverage and commercialization models, right? Basically, payers really want to know that what they're paying for is actually going to work, and they're willing to pull levers, change the way that they cover things, even move things off of benefits specifically to another type of benefit in order to make sure that they're going to get the value out of that reimbursement of a given medical device. One of the big trends that we're seeing here, of course, is the shift to pharmacy benefit for certain medtech devices, right? Diabetes is a great example of this. We've seen Dexcom and Medtronic really gunning after pharmacy benefit coverage and pharmacy level distribution for CGM products. And this really showcases that there is a sort of new reimagining as to how are these devices paid for and how can we get them into the hands of their patients while making sure that on the payer side, they're satisfied with that sort of level of commercial model. And when you move a product away from DME onto the pharmacy benefit from the payer side, there are some benefits. We have more direct management over that now. We're able to kind of control and pull levers on how it gets accessed more quickly. And of course, on the patient side, you don't have to deal directly with a DME sort of system where you have to go talk to the manufacturer and try and get the product itself, right? So these sorts of shifts on the commercial side are one great example of how payer expectations have changed and how MedTech is also moving to try to address some of those changes in expectation. Another big trend that we're seeing right now is this push and pull when it comes to diagnostic coverage from payers versus a push to, the traditional sort of like almost business to consumer sort of model that you see with DX tests, right? This has a bit of a digital health flavor, as we all know. In MedTech, there's always this open question of when is a digital technology actually a medical device, right? Does the FDA consider it one way or the other? And that's something that we see here as well in terms of this push and pull in terms of the key trends on the payer side. And then finally for MedTech, I think there's always the open consideration of when will payers start buying medical devices and kind of incorporate them into their full suite of offerings. We've seen integration between payers and providers before. I think in the realm of increasing technology, one future state is where payers start turning into a one-drop, white labeling medical devices, bringing it in and adding it onto their already very telehealth-enabled virtual healthcare plans. Next slide, please. It's not just the payers that are changing, though. Hospitals, as a key customer for a lot of medical devices, are also changing in terms of their expectations for new products. Much of that is focused on the hospital environment and driven by the fact that with the post-COVID world, hospitals still haven't really financially recovered yet. As Lee mentioned earlier, elective surgeries being canceled means that a windfall of revenue streams that hospitals were expecting has now gone away completely. Coupled with increasing pressure from payers to reduce reimbursement rates, and you can see how hospitals are really beginning to serve as a battleground when it comes to what innovation should be paid for and what products are really going to gain commercial success. In the future, what we're really seeing is that there's going to be an increased expectation that any innovation medical device, new technology, digital health will have to show some level of revenue generation, right? These hospitals outside of your Mayos and your Cleveland clinics are all financially under threat. And if they're going to put a big capital expenditure on a new tech or make a big financial bet on something, they're going to be expecting that allows them to get a better STARS rating, allows them to get more reimbursement, allows them to be in a stronger negotiation position with the payer for their rates. That's going to be the new normal here when we really think about it. In many ways, the old normal, just with a heightened sense of urgency. Another key part from the hospital side in terms of their expectations is quality measures and the patient experience. More and more, we're seeing that hospitals are beginning to really anchor on patient experience as a differentiator against other points of care in order to really secure that sort of customer base, if you want to think about it from a retail perspective. So new technologies are also really expected to show improvements in patient quality measures and the overall experience, so the hospital can ensure that it's still a destination point of care. It's still getting people in the door. That's how they make money. And then finally, the value, one of the key value drivers, of course, of any new technology is data. And how does that play into better decision making? And I think, data is a hot button topic, I think, across the entire healthcare space. There's a lot to talk about here. From the hospital side, though, it's not just about generating data anymore. They know that they generate tons of data from every single patient interaction. Now it's about how do you connect that data to a decision? How do you help a hospital realize the value of data that your innovation, that your medical device is able to give them? We have two case study examples that kind of showcase this a little bit more. So Lee, if you can jump to the next slide. One great example of this is, of course, this smart hospital bed product made by Stryker. And you can see how the way that they've kind of constructed and marketed this product fits on all of those layers. They're really focused on improving patient outcomes. So there's that patient experience sort of capability there again. There's a lot of focus on the connectivity with existing hospital systems. That's, again, that admission that it's not about the data that we generate, it's about how we can help you realize the value of having that data by having it connect with other pieces in the hospital infrastructure. And through all of this, of course, there's the backdrop of if we have a better patient experience, if we're better improving patient outcomes, you now as the hospital customer have a bargaining chip to go and argue for better reimbursement rates or to say that I have a better quality measure. So hits on all three of those themes that we're talking about. Clear path to better revenue generation, better patient experience, and gaining value from data. Next slide, please. Same thing with this Philips product, the Biosensor BX100. Same themes are applying here. It's not just, hey, there's a device, it does something, here you go. The value proposition is very, very sharp. And it's about improving patient outcomes, through seamless integration. It's about how you bring this data into the hospital infrastructure so clinicians and everyone can have more of a value generation flavor. They can actually derive value from that data. And it's, of course, about making sure that the patient experience is there as well. This is a single-use wearable patch. It's not super burdensome, and it's more convenient, right? I really want to emphasize this again, that in this new landscape of selling to hospitals that are under financial threat, you have to evolve beyond just talking about the, let's call it, first-degree value that your product provides. It's about truly understanding how your solution helps support the hospital in their clinical and financial goals moving forward. That's how you get sustainability. So I'll turn it over to Lee to talk a little bit about some of the additional details on how we might be able to support these things.
Exactly. Thanks, Waz. So again, in this theme of how to connect the evidence that you generate and communicating this value to making a precise decision, we see that in three main buckets about how we help our clients. It's in obviously value identification, and then creation and communication. Communication, my colleague Sean is really going to be discussing in the next lecture, but if we talk about this value creation area and evidence development, that's where we really come in and how we can help you and help to communicate the value right to that very precise payer with very specific evidence. we often find that we're presented with very generic, let's say, health economic models where the feedback from a hospital payer or the stakeholder would be like, okay, I see that, I see what you're trying to tell me, but that's not my situation and those aren't my patients, right? That's not my community hospital, that's not what I see every day, that's not my issue. So it's really important to get that very specific argumentation. And where we help with that is we do pretty much three main things. One is this health economic argumentation that's very specific to the audience. So how do we take that clinical value and convert it to an economic endpoint that a hospital payer can really understand and put ourselves in their shoes when making those decisions? How do we get some real world data that Angela also spoke of so that we can show the real use case to maybe people who are slow adopters and say, look, this is how it's actually being used in another hospital. Here's what it would mean for you and your bottom line. And then writing up this very succinct, very important value argument that Bob spoke of being very precise. And I can just say in our experience here at Certara, we've done more AMCP dossiers for devices in the past few years, maybe 2 years, than we have in 20 years. And I think that really shows that they're being requested, and that's a new bar and a new level set of what is needed from our clients. So just another example here. If we think about TAVR, this is a new heart valve device for aortic stenosis, a very, very serious condition. Patients with this condition tend to get paravalvular leak. A new fancy valve came out that's obviously more expensive than the prior one. Why should a hospital, when they barely break even on the procedure itself, actually carve more out to pay for the device? It would make no sense for them from an economic point of view. We took on that challenge and we looked at, from a Medicare perspective, if they were to use this valve, yes, the valve is more expensive, but the reduction in this paravalvular leak offset some of this complications that they were able to then monetize and convince to stock the new valve. We also were very precise in our economic analysis that it should only be used in very, very severe cases. So it's not, we want you to replace this valve and use it everywhere. We were very precise that this is the population and this is why, and here's the cost offset that you're going to have. And I will say, Angela spoke a lot about the differences in the US and Europe perspective. There, with a single payer system, you have to also be careful in Europe, and every country is different with their requirements about how to make those same economic arguments, but to a different type of payer. So here we did the same economic analysis, but looking at introducing this to a whole array of hospitals and saying, well, for the next 100 cases that you bring in, here's what you would expend and here's what you would save in a current versus future scenario. So these are examples of very specific arguments that you can make as a client to the actual payer to make sure that your valve is then being used, or whatever your device may be. And the key really here also is that despite all of those new regulatory hurdles and regulatory requirements that Angela walked through, which are pretty substantial, unfortunately it doesn't end there. The life cycle of these products really needs almost the same level of rigor that we're seeing in pharmaceuticals, meaning we have to continue to generate data, we have to continue to populate these models with new comparators, and we have to continue these analytics in the future. Here's yet another example. When we talk about capital equipment, that's another area that hospitals are a little wary about investing in. And here is an example of a new testing device. And what's really difficult about testing devices is that the trial data is always on sensitivity and specificity. And where we've seen the best arguments that move the needle are converting those sensitivity and specificity outcomes into how they change a treatment paradigm and put the right patient on the right drug at the right time. So making that economic leap and making that economic argument very clear can be what convinces a hospital to invest in a piece of equipment that would provide better and more accurate testing. And this is about false positive and false negative results, and how life expectancy can actually be altered if you get this right. Oh, okay. So in the last area that I wanted to touch on with my colleague Walt are a few studies that we actually did together, and this really speaks to some of the real world data and how that's helpful. So Walt, over to you for some initial remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And I think we illustrate a number of things that Walt and the group have been talking about so far here. One of the key challenges that I face in the products that I support is their ubiquity in surgery. So I use a lot of, we have adjunctive hemostats, which are used in almost every surgery, and suture, which clearly used a lot. And one of the key limitations of database studies is you don't have visibility to exactly where these products are being used. So comparisons can be challenging. In the first study was an adjunctive hemostat study where we wanted to really look at our advanced products, compare them to the original product, and understand if preclinical differences in utilization played out in the real world. So we were able to find a hospital that had recently switched from our original to our advanced products and look at the utilization comparison. And what we did find, in fact, was that the advanced product did reduce the amount of SKUs that were being used of the adjunctive hemostat. We were able then to model that for hospitals and show how, even though there's a cost premium for the product, the reduction in use actually created an economic benefit for the hospital, which allowed us to drive more adoption. The second study that we're looking at here really gets into barbed suture. And this was meeting a need for us where we needed to be able to describe where the suture was being used in a very specific use case, in a very specific procedure. And it was one where we were getting questions about complication profiles or safety profiles. And then also we wanted to be able to look at the economic benefit, because barbed suture tends to cost a little bit more than the traditional suture. So again, with being able to go to a single site, we were able to very specifically in the methods determine how the suture was being used, and then be able to understand the complication rates and see an actual reduction in complications. Unlike the first study, this is unpublished work. We're currently writing this one up and we'll be submitting it for publication here in the next quarter. The last one, I think, emphasizes the moving forward and when we develop evidence. So the prior two were more mature products that we were studying. In this third study, this was launch powdered hemostat that we did not have any evidence for in total joint. And we had some early adopters that were asking questions about how effective is the powdered hemostat in total joint, and what were the clinical outcomes. So we were able to partner with a local site to describe both of those shortly after launch by identifying somebody that had adopted this and changed his standard of care from one set of hemostats to the newer hemostat, which was actually lower in cost. We were able to evaluate the outcomes of that and then be able to talk to the safety profile in this use. So again, much earlier in the process for us, and this is work that we've submitted for publication and looking forward to being accepted here soon.
And what I think is so interesting in all of these examples is that, you know, it's really about increasing adoption, right? And I think one of the themes here also is how some of this real world data can then feed back to maybe some label changes and feedback to some of that regulatory steps that Angela spoke about, because label expansions could be looked at by the FDA using some of this real world data, maybe not in one institution, but perhaps in many. And it takes collecting these data, because as you said, it's not as easy to look at our typical claims databases to find this information. So just in summary, really what we're talking about here is looking at how to increase your reimbursement and increase your adoption and pull through. And the key is evidence, whatever evidence that comes into play. I think the bar has been set very high now for devices and med tech, almost at the same as pharmaceuticals. So you have to really focus on enhancing your value story, working early internally with your cross-functional teams on how the story is going to be told outside of just the regulatory pathway. And then tailoring some of the evidence and arguments to the specific payers, whether that be a particular country or whether that be Medicare or a hospital P&T committee. It can be a lot of different things where you have to tailor your argument very specifically. And you can do that through very specific economic modeling, data collection, and of course, writing up and communicating the value story, whether it be in a formal AMCP framework or in some of the communication strategies that my colleague Sean will be speaking of in the next section.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lee and Walt. I just want to kind of give a quick sense as we move into Q&A on any questions that are out there. We do have one question. Lee, this goes over to you. Overall, we've talked a lot about pressures, I think, right, that this industry is facing. So have you seen evidence generation requirements sort of increase year on year, and what does that look like?
Yes, I've seen a huge increase just in the requests that we get for things like doing a systematic literature review of PICC lines. I mean, PICC lines have been around, since the beginning of time. Who would have thought we would ever need some kind of systematic review? We're doing a literature review right now for a thrombotic device, and it's because there are all these studies out there and no one really knows how they all compare head to head. So we're doing some of our traditional pharmaceutical work now applied to the device industry, which I find really interesting because the data is much more heterogeneous. It's not as easily classified as our pharmaceutical data tends to be. And so we have to really be creative in how we write up these studies and how we publish them, and also how we leverage them within the value story commercially. What's going to really move the needle, and what kind of arguments can we make?
That makes a lot of sense. Walt, what do you think about that sort of perspective? Have you, in your experience, seen also sort of a heightened need for evidence generation? How's that looking for you?
Yeah, I would agree with Lee. I mean, we're doing a lot more systematic literature searches for evidence on kind of our legacy products, and the customers expect more and more data, more evidence for us about utilization, where they want to use it. And if you're coming in at a premium price, they really want to know that if you're going to charge that premium, that they're going to get that value out of it.
Yeah, I think that's such a key insight for everyone who's listening in so far, that in so many situations now, market access and commercialization, all of this is about certainty. It's about communicating so that your customer knows that what they're putting money down for is going to show the benefit that they're paying, that the promise of the actual product, right? Once it's being used by a patient, or it's used by a doctor, it's used in the hospital setting, etc. And that certainty is so critical when we think about your evidence generation plans, and also tactically, what are you doing to build demand and reach out to those customers, right? In terms of your sales efforts, or in terms of your market access or marketing efforts. So really appreciate the the commentary there. I think we're going to move to a quick break, right? Unless doesn't look like there's any other burning questions from the audience. So we'll move into a quick break, about 5 minutes, reconvene at 11:15 or so, and then we'll turn it over to my colleague Sean, who's going to talk about well, you have all this evidence now, assuming you have the really strong strategic plan. What do you do with it? And how are you actually using it in practice? So, let's all reconvene at 11:15, and see you guys then.
Everybody, welcome back from the break, and want to welcome you to the last session, which is Pioneering Digital Payer and HCP Stakeholder Engagement. You know, there have been a lot of changes in the last couple of years, particularly in terms of, and you heard Lee, Wah, and Walt talk about this, tailored information specifically to the needs of the payers and hospital as well, and digital delivery in particular. So, you know, I think it's left many manufacturers kind of scratching their heads as to how do they engage digitally and still have the impact they used to have with purely face-to-face interactions. So with that said, let's take a look at the global overview. The total digital investment and change that has gone into payer and HCP digital marketing, in particular with payer marketing. If you look at North America, leads the way at 1.3 billion with 28% change over the last couple of years. And then secondly, you look at Japan, which is second, at 43% increase at 890 million. Now, beyond those two, the rest of the globe is really trailing, right? So Europe, the top five is at 4% at 92 million. Latin America, 9 million at 2%, and APAC is 17% at 13 million. Oops, jumped ahead there. So when you look at the key developed markets and you look at their different stages of maturity, if you look at the y-axis, you actually see, you know, the digital versus traditional channel activity. If you look at the x-axis, you're looking at the digital sophistication of that omni-channel approach. And so like the last bit of information that you saw from IQVIA and IMS, this is, you know, Europe is in its traditional proven email. I mean, you're looking at email, you're looking at little interaction across digital channels. When you take a look at where the US and Japan are, they're using digital channels, but they're still dominated by traditional promotional channels as well. So there is a huge gap when you look to the far right and you look at multi-channel environment and you look at how those digital channels are being integrated with live channels and overall customer experience. There is a massive gap yet to be closed. So overall, you're looking at 32% digital channel investment, and then you look at or is increased by 32%. When you take a look at the total amount, you're looking at 2.3 billion, only 3.2% of the total 71 billion promotional spend worldwide. So how has the COVID crisis accelerated the digitalization of customer interactions? Well, it's done so by several years. So with the onset of hybrid interactions or video teleconferencing, as well as remote digital engagement, you're seeing a trend. And if you look across this table here or below with the graphic, you see where global is, APAC, Europe, and North America. And if you look back at June of 2017, less than 20% to less than 20% was the average share of customer interactions that are digital. You fast forward that globally to July of 2020, and now that's at 50%. So greater than half of those customers or interactions are digitally done. APAC, same thing. Europe, virtually the same. North America, it's actually substantially higher at 65%. So over the course of the last couple of years, there has been a substantial acceleration in digital engagement with customers. And there's a massive shift towards customers interacting through multiple digital channels at that. So what are payers, providers, and industry telling us about digital engagement? 39% of healthcare providers want all meetings virtual. So that's based on D2 creative data. A whopping 87% want to continue having virtual meetings. And less than 10% actually want healthcare providers to return to exclusively in-person meetings. And I think in the medical device world, this makes this very difficult, right? Because in the medical device world, face-to-face interactions are really where the bread and butter are very critical to levels of engagement. And that goes the same just for the HCPs and KOLs, but also for payers, right? When you look at budget and budget spends typically across medical device, and you look at what they spend in terms of market access, it's heavily weighted towards, you know, the field personnel and FTEs that they put in place into the field. And so in this transition, there has been a shift in general. So when you look at what payers have, how they've changed and how they operate, 52% of payers believe that interactive content makes meetings more valuable. So this is from another source, DRG. This is actually pre-pandemic. About half that amount of time the payers spend on digital resources daily. So when you look back at the other data showing the acceleration of digital content and digital needs, both for payers and HCPs, you can see that if you don't have a really solid omni-channel approach, that you really could be missing the mark in terms of your overall impact or influence on the payer population, HCP population. So what is the new normal? So based on the survey that we put out for this symposium, which of the following do you perceive as key challenges facing the medical device industry in the next 3 to 5 years? So overwhelmingly, all respondents said optimizing commercialization strategy. Another 40% said obtaining payer reimbursement. And so in this new normal, and the respondents came back, 84% in the medical device industry are finding a new stakeholder engagement model that incorporates online self-service, virtual interactions to be, if not more effective than pre-pandemic models. And that's actually from Certara in 2021, from where that data comes from. So, you know, overall, there's a shifting paradigm, right? You have leadership in the med device and med tech world say, okay, you know, and you look at this data, they're looking at the effectiveness of remote sales. And they say, you know what, in April of 2020, digital engagement, remote sales or hybrid engagements are less effective, right? You fast forward that over to February 1st of 2021, and the data is showing from leadership that remote sales is substantially more effective than what they thought even just a year ago. So when you talk to leadership and you see what that long-term shift is in commercial strategy, a whopping 90+% believe that it's likely to sustain 12 months and beyond the COVID pandemic in terms of remote sales models and digital engagement. So with part of our survey, we asked the question, in 2022, which of the following areas are you looking to increase investment as part of your strategic and budget planning processes? 80% said market access. 68% of those same respondents said innovation. So this goes back to commercial strategy, what that innovation looks like. When you break it down to other questions that go along with this, we asked how many of your brands utilize commercial digital stakeholder interactive tools while engaging payers in order to meet the growing payer need and preference for this type of interaction. And 60% said that they were doing that. But what they also said was that less than a third of the company's brands are doing that. In addition, we asked, has your digital engagement strategy evolved to cover the numerous local payers and white space where face-to-face interactions are limited? And 60% came back, and of the respondents came back and said no digital content for white space or local payers, which that leaves a pretty big gap in overall engagement, especially for local payers and hospitals, right? In addition, 60% also said we have some digital engagement and stakeholder tools. But going back to this piece here, it's low because it's only across 1/3 of the brands. So with that said, what are we seeing at Certara, and particularly at Base Case when we engage with our clients? And really what resonates is just because it's digital doesn't mean it's good digital. We find that there's a disparity between the marketing dollars that are spent on HCPs and payers' expectations. We find that medical device is lagging behind, particularly lagging behind, let's say, pharma in digital engagement with payers as well. And then you have payers and HCPs are going online more. And so it's not digital fatigue that payers and HCPs are experiencing in general. It's fatigue with how the industry is implementing their digital strategy. So you have a lot of emails that go out, you have a lot of Adobe PDF formats, or you have maybe even links to certain pages for payer materials, et cetera. And that is an overwhelming, overly promotional content that is being provided to the payers as well as the HCPs. And so med device companies reach out to payers and HCPs overwhelmingly through email and links or attached documents. And that is not what the customers really want to see. The problem is not the shift to digital, but it's payers and HCPs are embracing digital themselves. They just aren't getting the more personalized or tailored information and content they need. So like what Wah and Lee and Walt were talking about is, this shift towards very tailored, specific information, whether it's in the form of BIMs and value decks and the data that's in CEMs, it has to apply directly to the specific needs of the payer and HCP. If it doesn't, it's not that valuable to them. So if we look at constructing your digital strategy, how do you effectively engage them with this tailored information digitally? So some easy considerations, and this is something we guide clients through quite a bit, which is listen to the customer, have a voice of the customer piece and feedback system in place, especially for digital content and how you want to engage them in the market access space. Reimagine the sales process for the longer run. Realize that there is a paradigm shift. It's not likely to go away, especially when we revisit that data that essentially 89% of HCPs and payers want to continue to be engaged virtually. When you consider a technology ecosystem to help enable and support virtual sales, refine and update digital content and sales aids. And what we mean by that is, interactivity and the analytics around that interactivity can go a long way in supplying digital content that truly meets the needs of your audience. And develop, and most importantly, is develop virtual sales and training and coaching internally. When you don't have those resources to train folks that are used to doing purely face-to-face interaction with how they can integrate digital multi-channel approaches, then those digital tools and that collaboration that you have with, let's say, payer marketing, et cetera, they don't succeed. And we've seen that with a large number of our clients if they do not have a good plan in place to include training. So what types of payer engagement tools do you really have? They fall in basically two categories. One is person-to-person engagement for virtual and face-to-face, remote stakeholder engagement with externalized content. So it could be a portal of some sort where it's a workspace where people go, or a website where people go to interact with your content. With those two buckets, how do you implement them across digital touch points? And so when you're developing your digital strategy and your plan, you really have to take into account, how do you access, how do you drive payers and HCPs to your content, right? You have webinars, video content, events, you still have emails, you just have to be different about the approach in the emails, face-to-face visits, remote content, websites, mobile apps, social networks, etc. When you go to what we asked on the survey, what tools does your field force deem most helpful in negotiating pull-through for devices? 75% said digital engagement, and interactive content. The other 25%, which was pretty substantial, is unsure still, right? And so what tools were identified for coverage and reimbursement in the survey? So immediately interactive digital content, which included BIMs, RWE studies, publications, value slide decks. I think a great point that Lee made was the substantial increase in AMCP dossiers, particularly in the medical device worlds, and the utilization of HEOR data in those as well. And so when you look at, you have HCP testimonials that can be digitally conveyed, and then the tools you have for face-to-face interaction that make it much more tailored and efficient when you are in front of the customer and they do give you face-to-face time, which is becoming more and more limited. So overall, when you have a very good digital engagement strategy that's has an omni-channel approach, one, the value to that is you increase your touch points. You have collaborative experience, which can lead to even more face-to-face engagement and truly enhanced engagement when you do get that time. Improved outcomes, you come across as innovative. You have enhanced efficiency, just like we were talking about in terms of your field force efficiency, as well as just the overall interactions that you have with the HCPs and payers. And you can optimize your data quality. So here I've kind of summarized, and these slides will be provided to you guys to read a little bit deeper, but essentially 5 elements of building an omnichannel stakeholder engagement model. What's critical first is the vision. You know, what is the opportunity? What does that look like over the next 2 to 3 years? Where often I see the engagement model fail is lack of alignment. You have to gain leadership alignment along with all of the other stakeholders that you have involved in the process. And it is good, it's very important, it's critical to also involve the stakeholders that you are engaging. You know, identify the segments, the business units that you're trying to target, and then prioritize those segments and how you want to digitally engage those and position those interactions. And probably one of the most important things is, what is the resource allocation? So oftentimes when we talk to clients, a lot of them have what they call you know, a budget, but the budget is usually geared towards FTEs, right? Full-time employees and traditional means of engagement. And so they realize that they need a digital stakeholder engagement plan, but they really haven't planned for it in terms of budget allocation and what that means. Then you have the engagement model design itself, identifying the needs, the design and thinking. Critical to this is analytics, both internal and external analytics. So internal analytics on how the tools are used, you know, what's impactful with your field teams, or even remote engagement, what's impactful with the customers, right? And utilizing those analytics to increase and enhance the impact of your materials. And then capabilities, you know, do you have the capabilities in place? What's the platform or platforms that you're utilizing to effectively engage your payers and HCPs? The third piece here, implementation teams. If this isn't done right, then ultimately the digital engagement or even hybrid engagements tend to fail. So one, you need leadership backing and accountability. The leadership has to be a part of the creation of your digital strategies and the tools, and there needs to be a method or structure in place to be able to legitimately hold people accountable to implementation, because it is a paradigm shift, especially a paradigm shift away from pure face-to-face engagements. And one of the ways to do this as well is to produce squads or champion teams. And these teams work to involve all the stakeholders that should be engaged, so that your omni-channel approach is truly going to impact the customer and be well accepted within the organization. The last two, and I broke out analytics because analytics is absolutely critical, especially in digital engagement, whether it's remote or if it's a hybrid or face-to-face digital tools that you're utilizing. You have to be able to adapt very quickly to the needs of the customer. And the only way that you can do that is through analytics. So you have advanced analytics, you have simple descriptive analytics. If you're fortunate, you can do machine learning algorithms that are put into place if you've got the budget to go that far. And you really have to be able to use the analytics in terms of the augmentation of what your field and marketing teams are using and doing with your digital tools and digital platform. And then last, and I break this one out really from the third element that was out there, is transformational leadership. So this goes back to leadership buy-in and leadership really leading the digital omni-channel approach. So some of those key things are putting pilots into play, so you work out the bugs of your system, training, as we talked about before, being critically important, putting together a playbook, an SOP, so that everybody is on the same page, and then managing the performance of that digital engagement strategy. So with that said, as we're running a little bit short on time, I want to close it up on this slide. And this talks to digital communication tools across payer engagement. So at Certara, with Base Case in particular, we have done a tremendous amount of development of digital tools across the spectrum of the product lifecycle. And normally clients will end up coming to us with one or two tools that they want us to create digitally. Some of those are BIMs or value decks or dossiers. And what they realize is they start developing this digital strategy that there is a substantial amount of digital engagement that they could have with their payer and HCP base. And some of those, and some of the most important ones, are highlighted in bold on this slide. But digital engagement, what you find with tier 1 and tier 2 companies, is becoming, much more important, right? And they're seeing the benefit of that through the analytics and the interactivity, and they're seeing it because they're taking a much more tailored approach with their customers, and maximizing the utilization of digital technology to do that. So here you have value decks, you have care flow and treatment pathways that are highly interactive, support portals, e-dossiers like we talked about, value stories, BIMs and CEMs. We have hospital value analysis folios that are put together. All of those are very interactive, and they speak directly to the patient population of either the payer or the hospital itself, resonating, making that message really truly resonate. So we also have contract and comparison simulators, information portals that are highly interactive, payer pull-through tools for provider targeting, and things like comparative analysis and share shift simulators. So with that said, I'm gonna close this up and open it up to questions. But in general, there is a major shift that's been accelerated through COVID, and the companies that are maximizing that competitive advantage of going digital and omnichannel are seeing the fruits of that versus the ones that are lagging behind. Wah, over to you.
Well, no, over to you, Sean, as we move into the Q&A. One big question I have for you here is, when you think about digital content versus sort of traditional channels, which we've talked a lot about, what are some of the advantages of going digital, especially in a world that's moving to become much more complex in terms of what payers are expecting in terms of data?
Yeah, I remember the days when I was in the payer space, and you would have Excel spreadsheets with multiple tabs, you would have PDF documents pulled up, you had your one meeting that you had to influence, Blue Cross Blue Shield, right, in adoption of your product. And you would have all of these different things, and to include, 5 different PowerPoint slides, especially if you're representing a portfolio, it's even more complicated. And in that engagement, you really try to narrow down a tailored message to the payer using their database of their information, right? And that was very difficult to do. and it takes a very special kind of individual to be able to do that and impact on just one meeting, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of formulary access. With digital, not only can you engage the customer outside of those meetings, right, with this kind of interactive and tailored content, which gives you a significant advantage, but that also allows greater efficiency when you're also in front of the customer, depending on the digital tools, where you can really get very quickly down to what it is their payer needs are. If you didn't anticipate those right away, that helps you be very agile and nimble within the interaction itself, whether it's remote or face-to-face. In addition to that is white space. So, when you're relying on traditional methods, and a lot of that is face-to-face interaction without having a hybrid approach, you have a lot of local payers and hospital systems that you're not able to reach just because you don't have the budget or the headcount to reach them. Digital engagement changes that substantially. So what we've seen with clients is when you remotely digitally engage your local payers in the white space, you can have substantial impact comparative to a much bigger competitor that has boots on the ground. And that leads you to further face-to-face engagement, et cetera. But you can have a larger impact across the entire market access space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one additional question, since I think we've got some time remaining for Q&A here, that I personally have is, we've seen over the last couple of years on the sort of commercial side, not necessarily on the access side, but on the commercial side, much more of a focus on omni-channel, right? Like you've kind of moved away past traditional channels. Now it's not just, your sales force goes to the doctor, it's the sales force plus, content across all of these other channels. When you think about the future of payer marketing, sort of communicating these value messages, are you seeing that sort of movement towards that omni-channel sort of approach? What are some of the key trends you're seeing there?
Yeah, in medical device, I think it's lagging. In pharma, we see it much more aggressive. And I go back to, earlier in the presentation, I think face-to-face has been, and it always will be, right, the pinnacle of engagement, especially with complex data, right? The omni-channel approach, unfortunately, what that's become mostly in the medical device space is blasting of emails and document attachments. And that doesn't really speak to the tailored information, right, that they need. And so, in some cases you have companies doing website portals, et cetera, where they can access documents. But the key indicator here, and you saw it in some of the surveys, is that data tailored, and is that data interactive, right? I mean, can your payer, whether it's local, regional, or national, access your data and get intuitively access your information and get the answers they need, or feel compelled once they do to reach out to you to talk to you more. And that's the space that I think that's why it's called pioneering, the digital engagement for the payer space is because that's growing and that's fairly new. And understanding how to do that effectively is going to be the key to success.
Yeah, I think in many cases, med device is kind of undergoing this revolution, right? That we've kind of seen, that we've kind of talked about previously. So one of the key questions I would have for you is that, this story makes a lot of sense. There's clear synergies here. Why hasn't this really taken hold in med devices yet so far? Why are we seeing maybe a little bit of more of a laggard sort of behavior when it comes to the adoption of some of these approaches for this part of the sector?
I think part of it is recognizing things have changed, and understanding the customer. And, I think med device also is like, if I go back to your and Lee's presentation, right, the payer market access space was not historically something that was overly focused on in med device. Now it has to be, more than anything. And so understanding, one, how to engage that customer and what that customer needs to see to make decisions is something that's fairly new. moving, in addition to that, moving away from traditional methods of just pure face-to-face interactions, right? Without a really solid digital platform to create those kinds of tools for you and those engagements with complex data is something fairly new as well. So, we've seen clients that are now in the med device world really trying to incorporate HEOR, real world information, real world data. And that's complex. And so how do you do that from an omni-channel approach? And a lot of folks are still scratching their head, right? So, budget allocations are another piece to that. Are budget allocations there for digital engagement?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is no. And that's why I go back to when you're talking about your digital engagement strategy, leadership has to be thoroughly involved in the progression of what that strategy looks like from an omni-channel approach for the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. So really fantastic discussion so far. So we've got some time remaining, and this is the fun part, I think. We've gone through the presentations a little bit. Now let's talk about some of what all these mean, all of this means, right? So I think big picture trend to get medtech really facing a lot of change. Omnichannel, obviously one of the big things there. So Sean, if I were to challenge you to look 5 years from now, and I am maybe a CEO of a innovative medical device company, or I have a really interesting product line, and I'm planning for that 3 to 5 year horizon, right? When you think about my interactions with payers and from the content sphere, what are the key investments I need to make right now?
Well, that's a great question. So, if we go back to the slide where I had the digital engagement piece and digital touch points, if you look at every one of those in there, you want to have a plan, right? How do I digitally engage? Through email, through websites, through conferences, through hybrid or face-to-face interactions. Those are all the considerations you want to be thinking about, right? Like in all of those different channels, how do I create an opportunity for the payer or the HCP to engage with us where it's interactive and it gets down to the core needs of the payer themselves and their patient population, so that message resonates. And then how am I measuring the success of that? How impactful is our information? And am I nimble enough with this platform or with these tools to be able to outperform my competition, right? And so if you're putting that kind of plan into place, you also need to put the budget into place for that. And those are the major considerations I would say in the next 3 to 5 years. A lot of what you're seeing is HCPs and payers post-pandemic are not going back to the old norm.
Yeah.
They see it's much easier to dial into a webinar. It's much easier to do remote face-to-face engagement. And so if you don't evolve, essentially you die, right? So that's kind of where that's at. And that needs to be the considerations that, high overview of what you need to be thinking about for next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Now, Sean, you and I both work with market access, right? But I think both of us are actually ex-pharma. So for those on the line, we have a little bit. He's former Lilly, I'm former Novo, so we always have a little bit of that sort of relationship there. But one thing I think that a lot of our stakeholders often think about is, a lot of these omni-channel technologies and sort of perspectives are also present on the commercial side, right? That you've seen in terms of like marketing and so forth and so on. So when you're thinking about the future of sort of digital engagement from the market access side, do you see an opportunity for market access and commercial to kind of work closer together? What sort of comments would you have for maybe one of our future clients or one of our current clients who's trying to kind of sell or trying to push for these digital initiatives and then getting pushed back that, oh, commercial's already doing this? How do you kind of navigate those dynamics? Because those are pretty complex also, right?
Well, in medical device, a lot of the time, and a lot of our clients, what we see, and I was in the medical device world as well for some time, is you see a combination of commercial activity, especially in the engagement of hospitals, right? Being one with market access. A lot of the times they're not even separate entities. The key here is you're now working with real world evidence, real world data. You're working with HEOR data. Your teams are not necessarily familiar with how to work with BIMs and CEMs as well. And so the combination of all of that can be very complex in terms of the number of materials you have to present, right? Especially like hospital value portfolios. And so if you don't have the kind of digital platform or tools that make that simple and allow you to take that complex data and put it into a very simple story that you can modify and change as you're having discussions, I think it's very difficult, right? And so from a commercial aspect, the teams have to get very familiar with the overall value story and how that data and outcomes data supports that story. But the story has to be tailored, and it has to be specific to the needs of the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing, of course, is that so what we're talking about, we're also talking a lot about field-facing tools, right? So what thoughts do you have in terms of what are some best practices that medical device companies need to think about when they're trying to onboard their sales force or onboard some of those external facing stakeholders to use these tools? What are some of those considerations that they really need to keep in mind there?
Yeah, I think payer marketing and your marketing department, as well as the field personnel, have a very good system of collaboration, right? And technology and digital technology should be a key to that. So if you're using digital tools in the field or you're using them remotely, it needs to be something that is integrated very well within the CRM, so it really drives the collaboration between remote stakeholder engagement as well as your field team and what they need with the customers as well. So, what you see and what you've seen in the past is you'll have a web page, landing page where there's information and people will just send people there. That doesn't really necessarily engage and interact with the customer, and nor does it fully support both what your marketing campaigns and payer marketing campaigns are trying to do, as well as what your field teams are trying to do as well. And so, you need that connector. And you need the analytics behind those engagements to really drive what it is the customer wants from you in order to impact the customer with those materials.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That in many ways it's about building the capability.
Yep.
Making sure that you have the right platform to build that capability, of which we have, of course, one offering, right? But it's sort of really about that sort of capability building. Now, as we look at the last few minutes here of our webinar, it's been a great series of talks. Sean, what's one thing in the back of your mind that you really want for the people who are still listening in? Do you really want them to keep in mind as they think about medical devices in 2022, 2023, all the way up to the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, there is a new normal. There's a complete paradigm shift. Those who are adopting are excelling. Those who are resistant and are not willing to put that into their planning process are struggling. And in the medical device world, with limited access within hospitals more so than ever, and just limited access in general, even just to payers, that is absolutely critical that they have a digital engagement strategy in place. And that's beyond just the, hey, let's get past the next 12 months. Secondly is interactivity, as well as the need to really tailor your approach to your audiences. So one size does not fit all, especially with payers and especially with hospital groups. The content that you have has to be put in a form in such a way that they are truly able to get to what their needs are and how you meet those needs. It's just like what you guys were saying earlier. They want you to show them that what they're paying for will actually be guaranteed, or as guaranteed as possible, right, in terms of the impact that they're expecting from the product.
Yeah. Those are some really interesting and really fascinating insights, and I completely agree with the sentiment that whether it's medtech, whether it's healthcare, sort of the pharma life sciences side, there's so much change that's happening right now. And stakeholders who aren't necessarily prepared to navigate that level of disruption are going to be positioned in a less effective way. And especially on the market access side, where so much of market access is about certainty, and that's kind of thrown out the window with COVID and with some of these disruptive shifts. So I noticed Angela and Lee have jumped back on. Welcome to our informal after the symposium panel, I guess, the remaining 5 minutes or so. So I'll go ahead and throw a question out to both of you also. Sean just gave his thoughts on what do medical device companies really need to keep in the back of their mind to be sustainable and have success over the next 5 years. Angela, let's turn it to you. From your perspective, if you're giving advice or you're a thought partner to CEO of an innovative medical device company, what do they need to keep in the back of their mind and they need to plan for and allocate resources to ensure that they're successful in the next 5 years?
Yeah, well, I think that, we have this huge focus on Europe, but what we don't realize is the US is not going to fall behind. And so if you look at all of the clinical data and evidence that's being required in Europe right now, true, 90% of medical devices in the US now are under a 510K program, and they don't require that evidence because they're relying on a similar device. But I don't think it's going to be long until we're going to have to show that evidence for the US too. They're just not going to allow the US to be the easy place to be approved. So it's not going away. You're going to need evidence. If you think you're just not going to sell in Europe, that it's not just Europe. If you have a CE mark, that's looked at in many other countries. And it's also, like, for example, Australia, an easier path to get to. So what seems difficult is going to be the new norm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of resonance there also in the fact that as of right now, the U.S. is still the highest gross margin market when it comes to a lot of these medical technologies, whether it's med tech, whether it's pharma, life sciences. And I do think that, Angela, to build off your point, there is an increased regulatory risk that the level of scrutiny that we're seeing in ex-US markets will translate over to the US market, right? Especially even when we start thinking about things like digital therapeutics or even digital health technologies, which are currently medical device sort of regulatory from that sort of perspective. Lee, throw it over to you, same question. 5 years, you're talking to the CEO of Medtronic or J&J. What would you say they need to really think about to be sustainable in the next 5 years, be successful?
Yeah, I think it comes back to those really early on in clinical development, doing what we see happening now in pharmaceutical development, which is getting relevant payer endpoints into clinical trials and doing that early. So you're not left at the end of the day trying to backfill some of these economic points that you're trying to make when you're trying to communicate value ultimately after all the regulatory hurdles have been accomplished. So I think that we're going to be under that same level of rigor early in clinical development. And then, even in that post-approval period, that it doesn't end there, and to keep generating that evidence. And it's going to be beyond single center studies. I think we're seeing some of the single center studies that Walt spoke to, but we're going to need to be pooling data. We're going to need to be tracking data. There's going to be more registry data. I think it's a double-edged sword because it's a lot to set up and a lot to collect and a lot to analyze. It needs more budget, but then we'll have actually real-world data to reduce that uncertainty that payers feel when thinking about a device.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point also that I want to build on as well, because one of the shifts we're seeing on the pharmaceutical side is the increasing reliance on real-world evidence to demonstrate value. Right, and this is sort of it's not really a secret, but it's one of the key facets of our industry where, when we think about data and how you're proving outcomes, you have two use cases, right? You have data that's for the FDA, for the EMA, and then you have real world data that's often used for, going to get reimbursement with UHC or Aetna, et cetera. And what we're beginning to see right now is the merging of those two worlds together more and more, Lee. And to your point, where real world data, clinical data, all of this is coming together to really create that holistic picture to prove that my innovation has value and my innovation should be reimbursed. Walt, I want to turn to you. You're sort of our industry thought partner here today as part of the symposium. So in your next role, let's say, as CEO of Johnson & Johnson or of Ethicon or Medtronic or whichever medical device company you like, what would you be keeping in the back of your mind to be successful over the next 5 years?
Well, that's a big promotion, Wah. So I'd probably just be enjoying my new income. No, I think seriously, the things that I look at that would be coming down the pike is a little bit of what Lee was talking about with getting that installed or earlier in the development process, thinking about market access as we develop our products and making sure that they are going to be acceptable. I think one of the things that you see in pharma is patient population focus. And I think we should be thinking more about which patients our products are going to be best for, so that we can really show the value in a specific subset of patients and then halo out from there. And I think the other thing that in next 5-10 years, we're going to start to see a lot more similar to pharma is HTA, and needing to have evidence built to be able to address the questions that HTA bodies ask.
Yeah, I think that point on subpopulations is quite interesting. And Angela, I'm going to throw it over to you really quickly as a follow-up to that. So on the regulatory side, do you see an increasing focus or even signs that for medical device reg, you're going to want a really tailored or specified patient population there, similar to maybe how on the pharma side, they'll do very structured kind of like inclusion, exclusion criteria requirements or things like that. What are your thoughts on that perspective?
I think that you have to look at, there will be some of that, but it depends on the device, right? So what is the device designed for? And a lot of actually, this is an interesting question because a submission that we had for China, they said that you don't have any Chinese studies on this. And our medical director, his response was, well, our devices are made for all people. And so we didn't really, specify, a certain demographic per se. And so I think it would just depend on now, certain devices like maybe there's something specific to a disease population that's related to a population. And then for sure we would need to do that, but for the most part, I think devices differ slightly in that aspect. But as far as age, I know that a lot of devices, we have difficulty getting them into pediatric populations. And so, because doing clinical studies on pediatric patients is kind of a difficult realm to move into. So I think that there will be more of that for sure.
Yeah, excellent. So we're actually over time on the after the symposium discussion today. So I'd like to close out with just one final fun game for everyone. Future of medical device, the future of the medical device industry, medtech industry, and market access. You get one word. How would you describe that future? And Sean, I'm going to go ahead and pick on you. One word to describe the future of medical devices and market access. Go.
Tailored.
Tailored. I love it. That's a really good word. Lee, I hope that wasn't your word. What do you think?
Rigorous.
Rigorous. All right. I'm feeling the sort of Herculean vibe over here. Walt, what about you?
I'll go with dynamic.
Dynamic. Yeah. So rigorous, dynamic, tailored. Angela?
Probably detailed.
Detailed. I like that too. And then for me, I think my word would be certainty, because we want to make sure at the end of the day that our innovations, whether it's innovations we work on with our partners or we're developing in-house, are going to provide that value to our patients, that economic value to our customers at the end of the day. So with that note, I want to give a big thanks to our wonderful panelists here. Thank you for joining the symposium and also sticking around for the after the symposium. Love to see it. And hopefully we will chat again real soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.